Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Life of the Mind, an interview with Martin Luterán. My name is Fisher Derderian, and I am the Executive Director of the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this next interview in the series, The Life of the Mind. For those of you who have joined us before, you will know that The Life of the Mind is examining the situation in Central Europe, coming to understand Roger Scruton's work there back in the 80s and 90s, and of course, beyond that, as well as his legacy and the current threats to the life of the mind in the region. Our host, Mikołaj Sławkowski-Rode, has been a wonderful host thus far, leading us through examinations and discussions with people in Poland and Hungary. And today I'm quite excited about our next conversation with Martin Luterán, looking at the country of Slovakia. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce Mikołaj and hand it over to him. Mikołaj is the Foundation's Senior Fellow in the Philosophy of Culture. He is an assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Warsaw, as well as a research fellow and tutor in philosophy at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Mikołaj. Thank you.
Thanks, Fisher, as usual, for an excellent introduction. And it's in turn my great pleasure to introduce to you Martin Luterán from Slovakia, who is the rector of the Collegium of Anton Neuvert, which is one of the finest examples of the life of the mind and how it's being stimulated in Central and Eastern Europe. So a person of particular interest for this interview series. But before we start, I want to say a couple of words about Martin, who's a native of Košice, which is, if you know the geography of Slovakia a little bit, it's on completely the other side from where the Collegium is, close to Bratislava, the capital. He attended in Košice a Dominican secondary school of St. Thomas Aquinas, and he graduated from law school in Bratislava and obtained a further PhD from Oxford University. Beginning in 1999, Martin participated in the annual summer seminar on free society conferences of Catholic university students from the US, as well as Slovakia and other post-communist countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So an initiative very similar to that, which Roger was spearheading at the same time in Czechoslovakia and Poland. The seminary was organized by the Slovak-American Catholic theologian Michael Neuvert, who run events in Poland and Slovakia. And in the fall of 2001, Martin was a Witherspoon Scholar at the Family Research Council in Washington, D.C. in America. Returning to Bratislava, he and another Witherspoon Scholar helped found the Ladislav Hanus Fellowship, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which still is a one-semester study and enrichment program for Slovak university students. This has proven a fantastic success, and following this, Martin founded the Collegium of Anton Neuvert, which I already mentioned, and this is a full one-year residential program for Slovak university students designed to offer a deeper experience of intellectual and spiritual exploration and enrichment, with the goal, which is something that Martin himself says is the goal of the institution, is to help form students from Slovak universities to become the leaders, or the future leaders of Slovakia in 20 and 30 years. So thank you, Martin, for accepting this invitation. I'm very excited for our conversation today. And let me just start a little bit, to prod you a little bit on the Collegium itself, because it's a fantastic powerhouse of the life of the mind, which is a very unique thing in a way in Central and Eastern Europe at the moment, I feel, because as I mentioned in other interviews, and this being also the premise of the whole series, the life of the mind in communist Europe was led in an atmosphere of fear and isolation. But this has often meant that trust was very important and friendships were meaningful. And under the auspices of trust and friendship, the life of the mind was able to continue in secret, and people pursued certain ideals in their life they weren't able to do openly in public, and that strengthened their convictions. And somehow, paradoxically, when communism was over in Central and Eastern Europe, and that threat to the life of the mind disappeared, and the pursuits that people pursued in secret could be pursued in the open, they, to an extent, faded away. And the Collegium, it seems to me, and similar institutions fill this sort of role, or fill that gap. They are able to support something which has, found lack of support without outside pressure stimulating it. So could you say a little bit more about the Collegium and how you see its vision and purpose, and how it contributes to the life of the mind in Central and Eastern Europe?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation to this wonderful interview series. And thank you very much for your very kind and very detailed introduction. Yeah, and thank you for the question about Collegium. Of course, I've lived and worked in the Collegium for the last 12 years. So it is something very deep in my heart, and I like to talk about it. And it's interesting how you linked it to the studies under communism, of course, to the free studies under communism, which weren't possible. People back then, Roger Scruton organized this, I guess people watching these interviews and knowing Roger Scruton know very well, organized these secret underground universities. My Oxford supervisor, John Finnis, once came to Bratislava to give such a clandestine lecture. And it's amazing how much people had to risk in order just to listen to one lecture, right? And today, when there are so many lectures available online, and the question is whether people are still, how much would they be willing today to risk to know the truth? But I do think, that Collegium wants to build on this tradition of even these underground universities. In a sense, we are still underground. We are not an official accredited institution. Our students, when oftentimes their parents or friends ask them, "So what are you going to get out of it?" And my answer to that question is always, you're going to get education. You're not going to get a piece of paper. So the students that come to the Collegium know that they have to sacrifice a lot according to current standards. Of course, they don't have to risk being imprisoned, but they have to sacrifice, having a wonderful job that pays well alongside their university studies, or going to Erasmus program. They have to come here, and they spend most of their free time basically reading Aristotle, Aquinas, Plato, and things that their parents and friends don't understand. So I'm still happy to say that there are still people interested in coming to the Collegium. It's a mystery and a miracle in some sense that there still are young people out there, and we get twice as many applications as we can accept, that are willing to do this, to come and live together in a Christian community in order to, and all we promise is that you're going to work hard, you're going to have an opportunity to grow in all different areas of your life, intellectual, spiritual. You'll grow your character. You're going to have to learn to live with people you didn't choose to live with. And yes, it's a one-year full-time program, or it's a 2-year part-time program. So some students choose to do it alongside their university studies, and then it takes 2 years, or they can take a year gap year and do it in one year. So I see the connection, and I still think that the spirit moves. Moves young people, the desire of young hearts to grow and to do something with your life is still there, is still alive. And I'm happy to see that Collegium can still offer for 12 years. We're starting the 13th year in a couple of weeks with a new group of students coming, and it's still attractive, and it's still changing lives. That's the biggest and most beautiful part of my job, to see how the lives of young people are being changed by just being exposed to the heritage, to the vast, the beauty of the intellectual and spiritual heritage of the Western civilization.
Speaking of that, so it's not quite fair to say that the pressure is now completely off and there is no risk in engaging in the life of the mind. Well, first of all, there's the career risk of spending a year out of the job market, pursuing something that gives you no tenable qualification. But also, you mentioned, and I perhaps forgot to say, that the Collegium has distinctive and definitive leaning towards the Christian worldview, and in particular Catholic values. And this is, at least in the academic world, but more and more in the broader culture of the West, something that is risky, in the sense that it can, when proclaimed openly, can close doors. So it does require some courage from students and from people taking up the degree to affiliate themselves openly with that part, or the whole heritage of Western Europe, including that element of it, which has become in many circles quite unfashionable. So is this a consideration that students struggle with, or is it something that attracts them, on the other hand?
I think both. I think you're right. It's becoming more and more clear and kind of visible when you are a Collegium alumnus or alumna, that people kind of assign certain views or put you in a certain box, right? Which is not completely fair, because for one, yes, we do build on and a lot of the leaders of the Collegium are practicing Catholics. And one of the pillars of the Collegium is a chapel. We have dining hall, chapel, and library as three pillars, which, by the way, I just copied from the Oxford model, right? I mean, there's nothing unusual, nothing new about it. It's everything we do here has been tried before. And so we just offer the student a full opportunity to grow in all the different areas of life, including the spiritual. And we do attract sometimes students who are not Catholic, students who are not practicing any religion, who are just seekers, or students who were baptized Catholics, as most people in Slovakia have been baptized at some point, but who have not been practicing faith for many years. And sometimes they come out of Collegium as practicing Catholics, and sometimes they don't. So I mean, we are not, we don't make cookie cutters. I mean, we don't. It's not a brainwashing. It's not an institution where you come in and this is the expected result, and everyone who comes through it, this is what he's going to think. It's not that. I think if we did it that way, it wouldn't be a true liberal education. We're trying to offer the students the best we can in the limited time that they're here, and open them to ask questions, to search for answers. But it's up to them how far they get and what they do with it after they graduate, right? Because I mean, human life is a mystery, and yeah, we do have graduates who have gone through the program. Happy that they have gone through the program, enriched. But then years later, you see them and their life is going a different direction than perhaps what some of us would have liked to see. But that's the mystery of life. You never know how it's going to end. And I still believe that the time they spend here is a precious time in their life. The goodness, the truth, and the beauty that they experience here in their relationships with each other, with the great thinkers, with God, remains. Whatever happens later in life, You never know when it's going to come back. So it's like throwing seeds. It's like every education. That's what we're hoping to do, throwing seeds. But back to your question, the fact that it is connected to the Catholic faith, because all the serious study of the Western civilization has to be in some way, right? It gives label. Some students get a label, and perhaps it's right now in Slovakia it's not such a big deal, but perhaps several years from now it may be. Even the fact that you were in the Collegium 10-15 years ago might influence your chances in job market and other places. But it's not, I don't have any evidence that could support me saying that it is already a significant problem.
Yes, so that's so against the background of Slovakia, what does the Collegium look like, or the other way around? What does Slovakia look like against the background of the Collegium? Because that's one of the differences between the two states that emerged from the communist state of Czechoslovakia. That Czechia is very secularized, while Slovakia is still quite strongly Christian, and in particular Catholic. So what is the place of religion in Slovakian culture at the moment? It seems that it's holding strong in a way, whereas in many other European countries, and in particular Czechia, its most culturally connected neighbor, religion seems to be on the back foot. You might say that culture was always supported by religion, and now religion looks for support in culture, and in many places it's not receiving it. So what is the dynamic like in Slovakia, and where does the Collegium fit into that?
Yeah, well, according to the Pew Research Center, I think 20% of Slovaks still attend church services every Sunday. So 20% of Slovaks are weekly churchgoers, which I suppose in today's world, at least in Europe, it's a pretty high percentage. About 70 or 80% of Slovaks claim to be Christian, 70% Catholic, 80 Christian. So they're Catholics, Orthodox, Protestant Christians. So a lot of people still have some affiliation with Christianity in Slovakia, although only 20% of the population go to church. But that said, it seems that religion has not found its way back to the public sphere. Of course, it wasn't, it was destroyed or during communism, but that's 30 years. We're 30 years later, and still, it doesn't seem that religion has kind of a positive image in the public sphere, really. And there must be many different reasons for that. And the trends, the Western trends that are being, are coming to Slovakia and being more and more visible are surely part of it. But surely not the only part. I still think that, as Christopher Dawson thought, that secularization and the state of the Christian culture in our country is a result of Christians who are passive, right? I mean, if 80% of Slovaks claim to be Christian, maybe they're baptized. Well, they're probably baptized. 80% of the population. It's a lot of people. If all these people knew their faith, or at least if they reject it, knew what they're rejecting, I think we would be a different country, right? So I think, in some sense, it's easier and more difficult to evangelize, right? Because you already have a lot of assumptions about Christianity. You think you know what you're rejecting, whereas in reality, you probably don't know. You haven't really been catechized properly. So you just kind of live on this kind of folk Christianity that you know from your mom or grandma, which is not all that attractive. But still, there's a lot of young people with living faith, living Christian communities. Their charismatic movement is very strong in Slovakia. It's probably the most popular form of spirituality among young people these days. So I think there's hope. I'm not pessimistic. God knows what's going to happen years from now, but there are definitely many signs of living faith in this country.
So I wanted to explore the topic of the communist era just a little bit, because the connection between religious faith and Slovak culture really seems to come up very strongly during the communist period, which is evidenced by the 1988 candle protests, which I heard you talk about in 2018 in Poland, which was very, in a way, fortuitous, because it also connected to the special place of the number 8 in Slovak history. I remember that from the lecture. But I'm more interested in the candle protest and its legacy, because the candle protest in Bratislava in 1988 was the biggest anti-communist protest in Czechoslovakia since 1968, and possibly the biggest anti-communist protest that was religiously motivated in any Central and Eastern European country during the communist era. Most of the other movements had more of a secular social background, although they were, of course, supported by the church. The candle protests were explicitly religiously motivated. So can you say a little more about this fascinating event? It's a completely unique form of demonstration, and completely non-violent, and had a tremendous impact. And what the cultural legacy of this protest is in Slovakia at the moment, and of those events.
Yeah, it's a great and wonderful historical event that we as Slovaks should be proud of. It's fascinating. That's another typical feature of Slovaks, that we don't really know that much. We don't know our history that much. We don't really tell ourselves these stories as much as we should. But this was 10,000 people coming to Bratislava at the time when the communism was still strong. No one knew it's going to fall apart a year later. It was still strong. The communists fought against it. They stopped buses and trains. They knew that this was being prepared, so they did everything they could to stop people from coming to the center of Bratislava on 25th of March 1988. And still people came. They came to ask for religious liberty, for the appointment of bishops, and for protection of human rights. And they just wanted to light the candles and pray for 30 minutes. But that was too much. That was too much for the communists, and they dispersed the demonstration with water cannons. Arrested people. It was a brutal event. And there are still people living today who were there that evening. But the beautiful thing about it for me is that this was a result. This didn't just happen. This was a result of very invisible work that lasted for 2 decades at least, of building small communities, small underground communities. So underground church, or part of the underground church, that included thousands of people. And this whole work was started by 2 political prisoners, Sylvester Krčmery and Vladimir Jukl, when they returned from prison after spending 6 to 12 years in prison. They were friends of Anton Neuvert, and they returned from prison, and they decided that they're going to work with young people, and they created small communities of young people where you had these small islands of freedom where young people could actually read Bible, discuss issues, go on a retreat secretly. Of course, you always had to pretend you're doing something else. But everywhere they went around the whole country and started these small communities. And 20 years later, when a call came to come to Bratislava to ask for religious liberty and protection of human rights, these people came. But what's the legacy of it? That's another difficult question. Of course, a lot of these people were behind Christian democratic movement, the one Christian political party that ran in the first free elections and that were pretty strong and that formed political landscape in Slovakia for at least 2 decades. So there was, I think, but I cannot prove it, but I think this whole network of underground church had an impact on what followed. But it's, of course, no one was really ready for the fall of communism. This break is still kind of mysterious what exactly happened and how it happened and why, in some sense, in Slovakia, the government was still and continued to be influenced for many years by former communists and secret agents, which it's kind of a sad part of history that still, I think, needs to be researched and studied to properly say what and how it happened. But I think there is a legacy. One thing that it's a great heroic moment that we should be proud of and remember, and that this whole movement, the movement of the underground church and the people involved in it, I believe had and still has some positive impact on our society. I mean, a lot of the kids of these people come to the Collegium, that they learn, their parents have that experience of living or being part of a small Christian community and studying together, and they know that this is something that's important for the growth of a young person, and they encourage their kids to go and apply for the Collegium, which of course today is not the only option where you can form a community. In a free society, there are so many different communities and NGOs and all that. The uniqueness of the Collegium is that you actually have to open a book when you come here. You actually have to read and write essays, which doesn't happen all that often anywhere else.
Well, I was going to say that the Collegium does exactly what prepared the Slovakian community for the candle protests. And I want to move on to an extremely important point that you made just in passing, that no one was prepared for the fall of communism. I think this is something that 30 years after this has happened is quite difficult to grasp the full import of. But it's absolutely true, and the situation in Central and Eastern Europe, and many, if not most, countries in Central and Eastern Europe, can be traced back to this, lack of expectation and, in a way, unpreparedness. The lack of any plan or any real expectation as to what's going to happen. Everyone was in the underground for decades, and suddenly the underground became the world in which we live, and no one really, in a way, knew what to do with this and how to continue the kinds of pursuits that kept, to return to the title of our series, the life of the mind or the culture of the community going. But before we move on to this, I just want to say something that I remembered from your talk in Warsaw in 2018 about the candle protests, and which I found absolutely inspiring, which is that it was not a centrally organized manifestation where everyone knew that they were coming. Rather, if I remember correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, by that time in Slovakia there's only one bishop, because all the rest have been abolished by the government. And the bishop just said very informally in one of his speeches, or even homily, in one of his speeches, that he would invite anyone who feels strongly about the liberty to practice the Catholic faith in Slovakia to just take a candle and come out into the square in Bratislava and pray. And there was no other form of organization apart from these words being repeated by priests in other churches, and especially in Bratislava and the surrounding cities. And so the resulting situation was that not anyone really coming with a candle to the square knew that there's going to be anyone else there. So people went into the square not knowing, or largely not knowing. I mean, of course, there were some groups which organized spontaneously, but these groups did not know that they were going to take part in a demonstration that was in fact so large. There was no awareness of people taking to the streets and trying to overthrow or threaten the regime. Rather, it was something that was in a way much more courageous. People didn't know if they're not going to find themselves alone in the square. Is that right? Am I remembering this correctly? Because that story made a great impression on me.
Well, to a large extent, except that it wasn't started by a bishop.
Right.
It was started by two laymen, or a group of laymen, and the information went and spread among these small communities. So it was, in a way, yeah, it wasn't, there weren't organized buses to bring people to Bratislava. It was just, spreading, the information was spread through the normal channels that these communities had. And of course they didn't have much chances to communicate among each other. I think that's right. But it definitely, the priests in churches could not talk about it and could not invite people. It was all done through their communication channels. But there was one thing I wanted to return, one small link with Roger Scruton. Well, it's not so small, but when we're talking about the fall of communism and preparedness for living in free societies, Jan Czarnogórski, who was the first prime minister and who was the chairman of the Christian Democratic Movement, right? He was one of the best prepared people, and he was a lawyer, and he spent his adult life reading Salisbury's review, right?
He was also a friend of Roger's, wasn't he?
Yeah, right. Yeah, of course they all knew each other. So there's this important link. So there were, but we had very few such people as Jan Czarnogórski. I think in Poland it was a much better situation. I mean, in Slovakia and Czechoslovakia there were no free, no Catholic universities. There was no education, no private or Catholic education. Unlike, if I understand correctly, unlike in Poland.
Yes, well, Poland was the exception, really. This may be a story for another time, but there's an excellent story about the Catholic University of Lublin and why it was allowed to survive, or why it wasn't abolished by the communists. And this is because one of the founders, when the Russian army entered Poland in the First World War, one of the founders of the university in Lublin was quite close, had communist sympathies, and had the ear of no other than Lenin himself. And they approached Lenin and asked whether he could sign a letter saying that he allows for the university to continue. So that letter survived the First and the Second World War. And when after the Second World War, the communists came into Lublin, and they wanted to close the Catholic University, the rector then pulled out the letter and said, well, this would be against the wishes of Comrade Lenin. And so they inaugurated the academic year in 1945, the first academic year after the war, with all of the apparatchiks from the new communist government and officials Soviet army sitting as guests of honor at the inauguration, looking extremely uncomfortable, worrying whether if they don't come, whether they'll be shot because they dishonor Lenin, or whether they'd be shot for allowing this to go forward. But nonetheless, Lublin was allowed to function, as you said, as a Catholic university for the duration of the Polish Socialist Republic. And of course, it was a great center of free thought, with John Paul II lecturing there and many other excellent intellectuals. Yeah,
That's
so we were
fascinating story. I didn't know about it. Thank you.
Yes, it's something, isn't it? Yes, but we're going to come back to this in another interview, I think. So I'll leave the rest till then. But I want to come back to what I promised I'd come back to, which is the fact that no one was prepared, and this sort of translates into a situation that I think most people in Central and Eastern European, or at least those who live the life of the mind, or try to be cultured, or try to be connected to the culture of the region and the culture of Europe feel, and that is that there is a dilemma about what to appeal to when defining one's own cultural identity. So on the one hand, Central and Eastern Europeans naturally want to claim their right to the wider Western European cultural heritage, which they of course were completely denied during the communist period. All of the communist governments really wanted to say that there's something completely different going on here, and we owe nothing to Europe, really aren't part of Europe in that sense. But on the other hand, there's this very strong and understandable need to assert local identity, which was also under pressure from the communists because of the organized top-down new identity that they were trying to promote as, communist citizens or comrades. So these 2 points of reference, local identity and European identity, are often in tension in Central and European countries. It is definitely true in Poland. It is definitely true in Hungary. And this is, of course, a question that I like to ask all of my interviewees, because it's an extremely interesting problem, and it's very interesting how different societies and different communities react to this split of possible identities. So how does this situation look in Slovakia? And how is there this tension, and how do people approach it? And just before I allow you to reply, let me just say that we're inviting questions from all of our viewers, and if you can start posting them if you have questions in the Q&A chat, and I'll be able to pick them up and read them to Martin when the formal part of the interview is finished, which will not be in too long, although I have many more questions I can ask. So the identity question, Martin.
Yeah, well, that's $1 million question, right? I mean, it's so what's the situation in Slovakia? I don't have data, but I have, guys, my intuitions, my observations that I can base my answer on for whatever it's worth. It does seem that for conservatives or Christians, or the national identity is, or I don't know if it's national identity. It seems to be the case more and more so that Europe is viewed as a problem in these our circles, right? That European identity or European Union is seen as something it's a threat to our cultural identity, to our Catholic identity, to which is, it's interesting, but it's not the best solution to our problems, I suppose. At the same time, that's why I stopped myself saying that between the tension exists, but I'm not sure that the national identity is so strong in Slovakia, and not even in conservative circles. It's more and more so that national identity is being, and the whole question of national identity and national symbols is being hijacked by strange extremist paramilitary groups and political parties, and somehow then it's this kind of do not touch zone even for kind of for us Catholics. Now, when you compare it with America, where in the church, you have the Vatican flag and you have the U.S. flag. I mean, that's unthinkable in Slovakia to have a Slovak flag in the church. I never saw that. Why? We're sort of kind of ashamed of being very proud. Proud Slovaks, and of course we're a small country. I mean, it's different from Poland. It's different from Hungary. We don't have history of an empire. I like to talk in Slovaks as hobbits. I think we're hobbits. The Europe doesn't really. We're kind of a small country in the center of Europe that no one really pays too much attention to. So we can live our little insignificant life. But my hope is that even like in the Lord of the Rings, the ring would not be destroyed without a hobbit. I still think that there's a place and a role that Slovakia has to play in Europe. But being a hobbit means you're not really so aware of what's going on around in the other world. You don't really care so much about the big European topics. You see Europe as a threat, and I think but like I don't know if you know, but in a few days Pope Francis is visiting Slovakia.
Right, I had no idea.
He's coming for 3 days. Out of all places, he chose Slovakia, which is it's incredible. People in Slovakia. I mean, it's we only learned about it in June. So it's on a very short notice. Pope Francis will spend 3 days in Slovakia. After he spends one afternoon in Budapest at the Eucharistic Congress in Budapest, and he moves to Slovakia and spends 3 days in Slovakia visiting, several different places. It's unbelievable, and we're very eager to hear what he has to say. And of course, I think events like that, and Pope John Paul II visited Slovakia 3 times, and it's definitely something that we need. We need in order to better understand ourselves and our role in Europe. But I'm sure I haven't answered your question really. But I think there is a problem. There is a problem with our identity, both on the European level and the national level. There's a tension, but I don't know to what extent it is really articulated in Slovak, even conservative elites.
Well, you have in a way answered my question, I think. I mean, first of all, you yourself have begun looking slightly like a hobbit since I last saw you with the beard and the longer hair.
I brought my pipe.
I think that the picture that you paint of Slovak interests, which is of a hobbit-like small community that is interested in its local affairs, however small they may be, and seeing importance in those affairs rather than looking somewhere else for vindication, is a very positive picture. In fact, I think this is something that is in a way lacking in other places. I think to some extent lacking in Poland. I mean, my sense is that Poland has too little of this, and Poland, being a bigger country, wants to be larger than it actually is, and larger than larger than it should be. I think the way that Roger, for example, saw the future of the life of the mind in Central and Eastern Europe is in terms of interactions between communities which define themselves a little bit like in the way you're painting a picture of Slovakia defining itself and Slovaks defining themselves as a community which is first and foremost interested in the values and meanings that organize the lives of Slovaks. Rather than the values and meanings that organize the way in which the big wheels of the world machine turn, which is what Roger thought is an upside down way of looking at it. So that's a part of the answer of where the conflict between those two identities comes from, I think. The conflict comes from the fact that we're looking for the local identity outside of our community. We want it to be vindicated on the world stage rather than something that is our own concern and, you know, part of our own way of life. I think this is part of, at least that's what I think is part of the problem in Poland in a way, but I might get into trouble for saying this. So I'll move back to Slovakia and back to identity again, or continue with the topic of identity, perhaps with the most provocative question. I've left the most provocative question for last. And it's not my idea. It came from the first interview in the series, where my first guest, Marek Matraszek, a very good friend of Roger's, who was involved in the underground education that Roger was promoting and in fact doing himself in Central and Eastern Europe. So Marek remarked that although Roger recognized that Czechia and Slovakia are very different entities culturally and religiously, of course, he nonetheless thought that there was much that the two nations share and much that the two communities share. And he was sad to see the union, Czechoslovakia, break up, as he saw it a great achievement, despite the communist context in which it functioned for most of the 20th century. But of course, it existed before the communist context. It existed before the Second World War. And even though the communist context perhaps made it inevitable that the two nations will grow apart after the joint communist government falls, nonetheless, Scruton thought that there was something lost with Czechoslovakia disappearing and its heritage as one nation being put in doubt and, you know, in a way torn asunder to claim for the two nations separately. So I'm wondering about Slovakia. Is this something that is perceived as a wholly positive phenomenon that Slovakia is independent, or is there something more problematic about this heritage? Are there people who are nostalgic for that era without being nostalgic for communism, and who see, you know, a positive side to what Czechoslovakia represented?
Well, yeah, this is a very interesting and difficult and complex question that you know, goes back to 1918. You could say, you know, a lot of people still are sad and nostalgic for the lost Hungarian Empire, right? So for the great Hungary that was destroyed by the Versailles treaties. I don't think there really aren't any live dynamic groups that would call for the return to Czechoslovakia. Slovakia and Czech Republic, the problem, one of the reasons why, I'm sure there were many, but one of the reasons why Czechoslovakia had to split apart was that it didn't really begin the right way. Not all the promises were kept. There was a strange theory of Czechoslovak nation violently forged and forced onto people back in 20s, 30s in the first Czechoslovak Republic, and that wasn't true. There was never one Czechoslovak nation. It was always Czechs and Slovaks, like you said, with very different histories, cultures, religions. Well, not different religions, but attitude toward religion. So I think it made sense, although paradoxically, the Christian Democrats were the ones who were opposed to the split of Czechoslovakia at the time, precisely because of the kind of people that were in charge then. You know, Vladimir Mečiar was the one who was really behind the idea, and they felt this is not the right time and not the right person to do it. And I think they were right. And the history showed that what followed with Mečiar era was a big tragedy that harmed Slovakia greatly, internationally, internally. So it wasn't the best of times to do it, but eventually it had to be done. And I think it's good for Slovakia to be independent and to have its own, star in the European sky, because finally we have no one to blame for our mistakes. Finally, it's not Prague or Budapest when things are going wrong in Slovakia. It is our doing. Of course, now it's Brussels that you can start blaming, but I think it was a good thing that Slovaks had to kind of stand on their own feet and not be just the little brother that we always were in Czechoslovakia. That being said, I think the relationships between Slovakia and Czech Republic are very good as countries and as people. There still are, every fifth Slovak student studies in the Czech Republic. University student.
Really? Wow.
It's a great brainwash from Slovakia to Czech Republic, and a lot of them stay in the Czech Republic, so there's a lot of Czechoslovak marriages. I mean, culturally, these two countries are in very I think it's a very living interaction, unlike, unfortunately, with Poland, which to me is that's a sad thing to me. I'm not quite sure what to do about it, but it seems to me that with Poland, Slovakia has so much cultural and religious affinity. It would seem like a very natural partner, but for some reason, maybe the high Tatras are so high that the communication channels. Well, of course, I mean, there are people who are Slovaks go to shop in Poland, and Poles come to ski in Slovakia, and we go on pilgrimages to Częstochowa. I mean, there's something, but I think I would welcome more interaction and with Poland, the Polish culture.
I agree. There's definitely not enough completely, especially since our languages are so close. Since some of our viewers, or many of our viewers, might not know this, Polish and Slovakian are so close, at least in my own experience, that when I'm in Slovakia, or if I speak to someone from Slovakia in Poland, we can both speak our own language and still understand each other very well. There are some very humorous false friends, words that are exactly the same, they're homonyms, but mean completely different things in Slovak and in Polish. But more or less, the melody of the language is very similar. The accent, of course, is different, and there are some differences in vocabulary and grammar. But for a sort of day-to-day conversation, I couldn't read a philosophical paper in Slovakian, but for day-to-day conversation, I think the languages are as close as you can get in the Slovak language spectrum. So I think Slavic language spectrum. So I think it's a great shame that the two countries aren't closer. We could go on forever, but we've got at least one question from the audience that I'd like to put to you, and then we'll see if we've got a little more time after that. So the question is, as the situation in the US and UK begins to look more like life under communist regimes, including compelled uniformity, regular denouncing, and deplatforming of the wrong people, etc., what might we learn from the Slovak experience under communism and since?
Well, that's a broad question. I think, well, one easy answer is that whatever happens, we need to have and need to form intentionally small communities of young people, but possibly of families, small islands of positive deviation where people can still be free, can still learn the truth and share the truth and give it to their children, right? I think that's the biggest challenge today, is how to give is not the right word, how to share your faith with your children and not allow the world to kill it even before it has a chance to start. I think it's important to create, and of course this is all done in America and England, create educational institutions that do that remain no matter what happens. We need to keep the tradition going. We are part of the big chain, right? And it is our role to keep the faith, keep the truth, keep the heritage of the Western civilization, at least for our children. And perhaps one day will come when that tradition again will spread and will attract masses. But whether it happens or not, it doesn't really matter. What matters is our role, is what we have to do, what we can with what we have and where we are. And for me, that means today, building this educational institution. We still can. I think Slovakia is still a free country where I can do whatever I like, still relatively freely. Perhaps that will change one day, but perhaps not. And perhaps if another easy thing that you can do is to come to Slovakia and help us build the Christian culture in Slovakia, free culture in Slovakia. The more people there are with such mind, the better.
Well, it was, I think, my personal theory is that it was of great help to Roger himself in forming his worldview. He says so, in fact, openly in his intellectual biography, Gentle Regrets. What he learned or brought from his experience in Central and Eastern Europe is exactly what you describe, and this is something that very often was lacking, and now even, or in particular perhaps now, is lacking in the West. So I completely agree, but there's one problem, of course, which is that seem to in the West be working with a very different conception of what freedom means. In the West, freedom is freedom from all the things that you described as expressions of it. It's freedom from family, move out as quickly as possible. Don't be attached to, hangers on that restrict your potential to self-realize, break away from the church, which is only instilling various complexes and formulas that no longer apply in the world and all that. So it seems that there is a different understanding of freedom at play that drives these two cultures, the culture in the West and the culture in Central and Eastern Europe, apart. What constituted freedom for Roger and for those who attended his seminars, being able to do all the things that were forbidden under communism. Communism, of course, put pressure on the family as well as religion, and it was considered an essential freedom to be able to preserve those things, even in secret. Now they're being openly attacked in the West in the name of freedom. So that is a crucial idea. What are we free from, and what are we free to do or say in our lives? So the tension seems to be there, and I think part of the answer about what we can learn from Slovakia and from the Collegium is that we can affirm things in the name of freedom and not only deny them, perhaps.
Yes, and we can learn that from our political prisoners, right? From the heroes of anti-communist resistance, like Anton Neuwirtha himself, who was sentenced to 12 years in prison as a father of 4 children in his early 30s. And he eventually spent 6 years in prison. But he was still free, even though imprisoned. I mean, his understanding and living of freedom was possible even while he was imprisoned, because he knew and perceived everything as God's gift. He devoted his life to God and accepted everything that happened to him as God's gift, and he did the best he could with where he was. Became a doctor in prison, helps a lot of people die a peaceful and death. And the most important thing, he learned and taught people to forgive. He never hated his persecutors. And that's, I think that's the highest form of freedom. I mean, if you can do that, if you can decide to forgive those who arrest you unjustly, send you to prison, and you leave your wife and 4 children at home, and spend the best years of your life unjustly imprisoned, and still you don't hate those people, and you forgive them, and you lead your kids and others to forgive. I think that's the highest form of freedom, because that person, no one can hurt that person anymore. I mean, there's nothing you can do to him. I mean, the worst thing that you can do to him is to kill him, but I mean, death is a gift, as well as everything else that happens to life, to people, to such free people as Anton Neuvert was. So I think there's a lot to learn. I mean, there's a lot to learn from these stories of the whole generation of men in Central and Eastern Europe that suffered under communism. And I thought a lot of those stories are still hidden, and I think it will require the whole next generation to uncover those stories and bring them to attention and offer them to the whole world, because this is one particular era in history of mankind where people fought against tremendous evil and did a very good job. Some of them, at least.
Superb. I think that's an excellent note to end on. Although we could go on for much longer, of course. But let me, before I hand over to Fischer, let me thank you once again for accepting this invitation, for the fantastic conversation that we've had. I think it's just right that this is the kind of lesson that we want to learn from Central and Eastern Europe, and the kind of lesson that Central and Eastern European countries and citizens should be more brave in owning up to and seeing in themselves. So thank you ever so much, and that will be goodbye from me, and back over to our CEO, Fischer Derderian.
Well, thank you very much again. Thank you for your great questions and a wonderful conversation, and for the invitation to this event. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Martin, and thank you, Mikołaj, for another wonderful discussion. I think a very interesting one, exploring Slovakia. And just to put a final comment, perhaps, on the discussion itself, I believe Roger at one point said in an interview or discussion of something of this sort, the duty that we have is not to find the things that we hate, that we resent, but to find the things that we love, and to champion and ensure that others love them too. So I think that's exactly what's happening at the Collegium, and the good work that you're doing, Martin, and perhaps something we all can learn from Slovakia and indeed the larger Central European region. But with that, I want to thank everyone for watching today, for joining us, and for those of you who watch this at a later point on YouTube or wherever else you might find it. If you are interested in following along, if you enjoyed today's conversation and want to hear more, whether in this series, The Life of the Mind, or in others, I encourage you to follow us on social media, on our Twitter and Instagram pages, on our YouTube account, and of course, go to our website, www.scruton.org, to sign up for a newsletter and find more upcoming events and information on programs that we're hosting there. So with that, thank you again, Martin. Thank you again, Mikołaj, and I hope you all have a lovely day.